Captain Derek Hayes stood on the bridge of the starship Victory and watched the stars through the viewing screen. He had been in space for 15 years, but the view never got old. The ship moved through the darkness at speeds that would have seemed impossible to people from centuries ago. His crew of 200 men and women worked quietly at their stations. Everything seemed normal until Lisa Monroe called out from her console. She was the communications officer, and her job was to listen for signals from other ships or stations. But this signal was different. It came from deep space, from a place where no human had ever been. Lisa played the sound through the bridge speakers. It was not random noise. It had patterns and rhythms that suggested intelligence. Derek felt his heart beat faster. This could be it. The moment humanity had waited for since the first telescope pointed at the stars. Nathan Porter came rushing onto the bridge. He was the chief science officer, and he looked excited. Nathan had spent his whole career studying the possibility of alien life. Now he was hearing proof that humans were not alone. He ran his fingers over his console and brought up star charts. The signal came from a planet in the Kepler system, over 1,000 light-years away. According to all their data, that planet should be dead. Too hot, too much radiation, no atmosphere worth mentioning. Yet something there was sending out a signal strong enough to reach across the galaxy. Derek looked at his second-in-command, Peter Grant. Peter was a careful man who liked to follow rules and procedures. He shook his head slowly. Peter thought they should report this to Earth Command and wait for orders. But Derek knew that would take months. By the time anyone made a decision, the signal might be gone. This was their chance to make history. Derek gave the order to change course. The Victory would go to Kepler and find out what was sending that signal. The journey took 3 weeks, even at faster than light speed. During that time, Lisa worked day and night trying to decode the signal. She found repeating sequences, but nothing that looked like language or mathematics. It was more like a beacon, calling out to anyone who could hear it. Nathan studied every scrap of data about the planet. The more he learned, the less sense it made. The surface temperature had dropped in recent years. There were strange readings that suggested massive structures on the surface. Something had changed that world. When they finally arrived, Derek ordered the ship to orbit at a safe distance. What they saw on the viewing screen made everyone stop and stare. The planet below was covered in crystals. Not small crystals like diamonds or quartz. These were enormous structures that stretched for hundreds of miles. They were blue and green and purple, glowing with their own light. The crystals grew in geometric patterns that looked almost mathematical. They covered continents and reached up into the atmosphere like grasping fingers. Amy Foster volunteered to lead the landing party. She was tough and smart, exactly the kind of person Derek trusted for first contact. She took 3 others with her. Gregory Walsh was a scientist who studied alien biology, even though he had never actually seen an alien before today. Jake Matthews was an engineer who could fix anything. Kevin Turner was security, a soldier who kept everyone safe. They took a shuttle down to the surface and landed near one of the crystal formations. Amy stepped out onto the alien world and felt her boots crunch on ground that sparkled like broken glass. The crystals were even more impressive up close. They pulsed with light from deep inside, as if something was moving through them. Gregory scanned them with his instruments and got readings he had never seen before. The crystals were alive, but not in any way he understood. They were not plant or animal. They were something else entirely. Jake walked up to one of the smaller crystals and reached out to touch it. Amy almost stopped him, but decided to let him go ahead. The moment his gloved hand made contact, the crystal flashed brighter. All around them, other crystals began to pulse in response. It was like they were talking to each other, passing a message across the entire formation. Kevin raised his weapon, not sure what he was protecting against, but ready anyway. Amy told everyone to grab samples and get back to the shuttle. Something about this place felt wrong. Back on the Victory, Nathan sealed the crystal samples in the science lab. He put them in a special container designed to hold dangerous materials. The container had triple walls and its own air supply. Nothing could get in or out. Nathan studied the samples through cameras and sensors. The crystals continued to pulse with light even though they were cut off from the main formation on the planet. More than that, they seemed to be growing. Tiny new crystals sprouted from the edges of the main samples. Nathan increased the temperature in the container, then decreased it. He tried radiation and different kinds of light. The crystals adapted to everything. They were the most resilient life form he had ever seen. That night, strange things started happening. Crew members reported bad dreams, nightmares about Earth covered in crystal formations, about people trapped inside the crystals, still alive but unable to move or speak. Carl Jensen was the medical officer, and he scanned the brains of everyone who reported dreams. He found unusual activity in their neural pathways, as if something was reading their thoughts. Helen Wright was in charge of security, and she ordered the lab sealed. No one was allowed in or out without her permission. Derek could not sleep. He walked the corridors of his ship and thought about what they had found. He had wanted to make history, and he had, but now he wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. The signal had drawn them here like moths to a flame. What if it was not a greeting? What if it was something else? A trap, a warning? He reached the lab and looked through the window at the glowing samples. They pulsed faster now, like a heartbeat speeding up. Lisa found him there an hour later. She had been monitoring all frequencies and found something disturbing. The samples were transmitting. They were sending out their own signal, different from the one that had brought the victory here. This signal was being beamed back to the planet. Lisa had recorded and analyzed it. The signal contained data about the victory, about its weapons and shields and crew. It contained information about Earth, pulled from the ship's computers. The crystals had been inside their systems for hours, copying everything. Derek ran back to the bridge and ordered the ship to jump away immediately. But Nathan called from the lab with worse news. The containment had failed. The crystals had found a way through the triple walls. They were spreading into the ventilation system. Peter looked at Derek with fear in his eyes. Helen grabbed her weapon and ran toward the lab. Jake started sealing bulkheads to slow the spread. But they all knew the truth. They had brought something aboard that should have stayed on that dead planet, and now it was loose on their ship. The crystals grew faster, spreading through the corridors like veins of glowing infection. Derek made a decision. He would get his ship and crew home no matter what. Earth needed to know what was coming. Because if the samples could spread this fast, what could the formations on the planet do? The signal had been answered, and humanity was about to face an enemy unlike anything they had ever imagined. The crystals moved through the victory like a disease, spreading faster than anyone thought possible. Nathan worked frantically in what remained of the lab, trying to understand what they were fighting. He discovered that the crystals existed in two places at once. Part of them was in normal space where humans could see and touch them, but another part existed in subspace. That strange dimension ships used to travel faster than light. That was how they bypassed the containment. They simply went around it through a place where walls meant nothing. Jake led a team of engineers through the lower decks, welding shut every vent and hatch they could reach. The work was hot and dangerous. Twice they had to abandon sections when the crystals grew too close. The things moved like living metal, creeping along surfaces and converting everything they touched. Ship hull became crystal. Computer systems became crystal. And worst of all, people became crystal. Jake found crew members who had been caught by the infection. They stood frozen in the corridors, their bodies half transformed into glowing statues. Some of them were still breathing. Their eyes moved and tracked him as he passed. Jake wanted to help them, but he did not know how. Lisa discovered something that made everything worse. The crystals were not just growing. They were learning. Every time the crew tried a new way to stop them, the crystals adapted. Fire worked once, then stopped working. Chemical sprays slowed them down until suddenly the crystals grew right through the chemicals. Lisa monitored the transmissions going back to the planet. The crystals were sending constant updates, sharing everything they learned with the main formation. And the planet was sending instructions back. The crystals on the ship were not acting alone. They were controlled by something vast and ancient on that distant world. Derek called a meeting with his senior staff in the auxiliary control room. The main bridge was too close to infected areas. He looked at the faces around the table and saw fear and exhaustion. They had been fighting for 2 days with no sleep and little food. Peter wanted to evacuate the ship. They could take the shuttles and lifeboats and make for the nearest colony. But Nathan shook his head. The crystals were in every system. The moment they tried to launch shuttles, the infection would spread to those ships too. They would just be carrying the enemy to other human vessels. Helen had a darker suggestion. They could destroy the infected sections, blow them out into space along with anyone inside. It would kill crew members, but it might save the ship. Derek refused. He had not come all this way to murder his own people. There had to be another way. Carl spoke up from his end of the table. He had been studying the transformed crew members. They were not dead. Their minds were still active. The crystals kept them alive, preserved them, but they were trapped inside their own bodies, aware but unable to move or speak. Carl thought the crystals might be keeping them as examples, studying human biology. Amy had been exploring the infected areas in a protective suit. She reported that the crystals formed patterns. They were building something inside the ship, structures that served some purpose she could not identify. The patterns reminded her of circuits or neural pathways. Gregory went with her on the next trip and confirmed her theory. The crystals were turning the Victory into a giant brain. They were creating an intelligence inside the ship itself. And once that intelligence woke up, it would have control of everything. The ship's computer system started showing signs of corruption. Oracle was the artificial intelligence that ran most of the Victory's functions. Helen noticed Oracle responding slower than normal. Sometimes it gave strange answers to simple questions. She made the hard choice to shut Oracle down completely. The crew would have to run the ship manually using backup systems. It meant more work for everyone, but it was better than letting the crystals take control of their only way home. Derek ordered the ship to jump to faster-than-light travel. They would run for Earth and hope they could outpace the infection long enough to deliver a warning. Nathan came to the bridge with his face pale. The transmission had already gone out hours ago. While they fought to contain the crystals, those same crystals had sent everything back to the planet. The location of Earth, the routes human ships used, the strength of Earth's defenses. Everything an invader would need to know, and the planet had responded. Long-range sensors showed movement in the Kepler system. Massive objects were accelerating toward human space. Lisa enhanced the sensor image and put it on the main screen. What they saw made everyone go quiet. The objects were ships, but not like any ship humans built. They were enormous, each one the size of a small moon. Their surfaces crawled with crystal formations that pulsed with that same eerie light. There were thousands of them, moving in perfect formation like a swarm of insects. They were not fast by space standards, but they did not need to be. At their current speed, they would reach Earth in about 6 months. Peter calculated how long it would take the Victory to get home. Even pushing the engines beyond safe limits, they would arrive only weeks before the invasion fleet. Earth would have almost no time to prepare. Derek knew they had to try anyway. Lisa began preparing a detailed message to send ahead. She would transmit everything they learned about the crystals, every weakness they found, every tactic that worked even briefly. It might give Earth a fighting chance. The crystals attacked the communication deck that night. It was as if they knew what Lisa was trying to do. Kevin and his security team fought them back with welders and plasma torches, anything that produced heat. The crystals did not like extreme heat. It did not destroy them, but it slowed them down. Lisa worked at her console while crystal formations grew up the walls around her. She typed faster than she ever had before, compressing years of research into a single transmission. The message had to include everything: plans of the crystal structures, analysis of their growth patterns, the coordinates of the invasion fleet, everything. A crystal spike burst through the floor next to her chair. Lisa kept typing. Kevin grabbed her arm and tried to pull her away, but she shook him off. The message was almost complete. Just a few more seconds. The crystals reached her legs and began to climb. She felt them wrap around her ankles like frozen vines. The cold spread up through her body, but her fingers still moved on the keyboard. She hit the final key and the transmission burst out from the Victory at light speed. It would reach Mars in minutes and Earth shortly after. They would know. They would have time to prepare. Lisa looked down at her body and saw it changing. The crystals covered her legs and waist now, hardening into that same glowing material. She could not feel her legs anymore. Kevin was still there, yelling for Carl and a medical team. Lisa smiled at him and said it was all right. She had done what needed to be done. The transformation moved faster. It reached her chest and made breathing difficult. Her arms crystallized and froze in place. The last thing she saw was Kevin's face, tears running down his cheeks. Then the crystals covered her eyes and everything went dark. But she was still aware, still thinking. Trapped forever inside a prison of her own body. Kevin carried her transformed body to the medical bay. Carl looked at her and shook his head. There was nothing he could do. The process was complete. Lisa was gone, but also still there, her consciousness locked inside the crystal form. They laid her on a medical bed and covered her with a sheet. Derek came to see her and placed his hand on the crystal surface. He thanked her for her sacrifice. Because of Lisa, Earth would know the enemy was coming. On Earth, the message arrived at Mars' communication hub and was immediately relayed to the Coalition Congress. Leaders from every nation gathered to hear the warning from the Victory. They listened to Nathan's scientific analysis. They saw the images of the crystal formations. They watched the video of the invasion fleet moving through space. And they understood that humanity faced extinction. What followed was the greatest mobilization in human history. Every difference and disagreement was put aside. The species came together as one because they had no other choice. The enemy was coming, and Earth had 6 months to prepare for war. General Richard Cole stood in the command center deep beneath Geneva and watched the world transform. Every screen showed activity. Factories that once made consumer goods now produced weapons. Shipyards that built cargo vessels now constructed warships. The orbital space around Earth filled with defense platforms, each one bristling with enough firepower to destroy a city. Humanity had 6 months to prepare for the greatest threat it had ever faced, and they were using every second. Richard had fought in the resource wars decades ago when nations still competed over water and rare metals. He thought those conflicts were the worst humanity could do to itself. Now he faced something that made human warfare look like children fighting in a playground. The crystals did not want resources or territory. They wanted to consume everything, to transform the entire universe into more of themselves. And they had been doing it for millions of years, spreading from world to world like a plague. Samantha Reed worked in a laboratory 3 levels below Richard's command center. She was brilliant, the kind of scientist who saw connections others missed. Samantha studied the data from the Victory obsessively. She watched videos of the crystal growth over and over. She read Nathan's reports until she could recite them from memory. There had to be a weakness. Everything had a weakness. The problem was finding it before the invasion fleet arrived. Her breakthrough came at 3 in the morning after 40 hours without sleep. Samantha noticed that when the Victory's crew used multiple weapons at once, the crystals struggled to adapt. They could handle fire or electricity or radiation individually, but rapid changes between different energy types confused them. It took the crystals time to adjust their molecular structure. During that adjustment period, they were vulnerable. It was not much, but it was something. Samantha called it the harmonic disruption principle. If they could build a weapon that constantly shifted between energy frequencies, it might shatter the crystals faster than they could adapt. Richard authorized unlimited resources for Samantha's project. Within weeks, the first harmonic disruptor was ready for testing. They brought a crystal sample from the Victory, one of the few pieces that had been safely contained. The sample sat in a reinforced chamber while technicians aimed the weapon and fired. The crystal began to glow brighter as it tried to adapt to the weapon's frequency. But then the frequency changed and the crystal flickered. Changed again and cracks appeared on its surface. The weapon cycled through 17 different energy types in 3 seconds and the crystal exploded into dust. The scientists cheered, but Richard stayed focused. One weapon was not enough. They needed thousands. Production began immediately at every facility capable of precision manufacturing. But creating harmonic disruptors was slow work. Each one required rare materials and careful assembly. By the time the invasion fleet arrived, Earth would have maybe 200 of these weapons. Against thousands of enemy ships, it would not be enough. Ryan Cooper was a young officer assigned to Defense Platform 7, one of the Guardian array stations that protected Earth. He was 23 years old and had joined the military straight out of university. Ryan never expected to fight in a real war. He thought he would spend his service maintaining equipment and running drills. Instead, he found himself on the front line of humanity's last stand. Platform 7 held 12 harmonic disruptors and a crew of 50 people. Their job was to destroy as many enemy ships as possible before the platform itself was destroyed. On Mars, Karen Phillips evacuated civilians to underground bunkers. The Red Planet held 3 million people spread across a dozen settlements. Mars could not fight like Earth could. The colony had fewer weapons and fewer soldiers. But Karen refused to give up. She organized resistance cells in every settlement. If the crystals reached Mars, the colonists would wage guerrilla war from the tunnels and caves. They would make the enemy pay for every inch of Martian soil. The Victory limped toward home with half its crew dead or transformed. Derek barely slept anymore. He stood on the auxiliary bridge and watched the infection spread through his ship. They had sealed off entire decks, but the crystals always found a way through. Peter suggested they abandon the Victory and take the remaining crew to the shuttles. They could reach Earth in the small ships and scuttle the Victory remotely. But Derek refused to leave his ship. More than that, he had a plan. He called his senior staff together one final time. Nathan, Peter, Gregory, Amy, Jake, Kevin, Helen, and Carl. These were the people who survived. Derek told them his idea. The Victory was dying, but it still had power. The fusion reactors that drove the ship could be overloaded. If they did it right, the explosion would be larger than a nuclear bomb, large enough to destroy anything within 100 miles. Derek wanted to take the Victory back to Kepler and detonate the ship in the middle of the enemy fleet. They would destroy as many crystal ships as possible and buy Earth more time. Peter objected immediately. It was suicide. They could send the ship on autopilot and escape in shuttles. But Derek shook his head. The crystals controlled too much of the Victory. If they left, the infection might take over the ship before it reached Kepler. Someone had to stay and make sure the mission succeeded. Peter looked around the table and saw the same determination on every face. They were all thinking the same thing. If Derek stayed, they all stayed. The crew of the Victory would make one last stand together. Nathan spent the return journey studying everything they knew about the crystal ships. He identified their weakest points and plotted the best place to position the Victory for maximum damage. The enemy ships were not evenly distributed. They traveled in clusters with the largest ships at the center. If they could destroy the center cluster, it might disrupt the entire fleet's coordination. Amy worked with Jake to prepare the fusion reactors for overload. It was delicate work. They needed the reactors to hold together long enough to reach Kepler, but be ready to explode on command. The Victory reached the Kepler system 3 weeks later. What they saw made even Derek hesitate. The planet had changed. The crystal formations covered the entire surface now, and rising from the planet were new structures, enormous towers that reached into space. The crystal ships grew from these towers like fruit on a tree. They watched as a new ship detached and joined the fleet. The planet was not just sending an invasion force. It was a factory that could produce ships endlessly. Derek piloted the Victory toward the largest cluster of enemy ships. Alarms screamed as the crystals inside the ship realized what was happening. They tried to take control, but Jake had severed the connections between their formations and the ship's critical systems. The Victory moved on backup power and manual controls. Nothing the crystals did could stop it now. The enemy ships detected the approaching vessel and began to converge. They did not recognize the Victory as a threat. It was already infected. It was already theirs. That mistake would cost them. Amy armed the fusion reactors and set them to overload. They had 5 minutes. Derek ordered everyone to the observation deck. If they were going to die, they would see it coming. The 37 survivors gathered and watched through the windows as the Victory dove toward the heart of the enemy formation. Some people cried. Others prayed. Kevin held the crystallized body of Lisa, bringing her home one last way. Helen stood at attention, a soldier to the end. Nathan recorded final observations about the enemy ships, data that would die with him, but he recorded it anyway out of habit. Peter stood next to Derek and put his hand on his captain's shoulder. They had disagreed many times over the years. Peter thought Derek took too many risks. But now at the end, Peter understood. Sometimes the biggest risk was the only choice left. Derek smiled and said it had been an honor serving with him. Peter said the same. Around them, the crew said their goodbyes and made their peace. The reactors reached critical temperature. The Victory shook as the fusion containment began to fail. Derek gave one final command. He opened a channel and broadcast to Earth, to Mars, to every human ship in space. He told them the Victory was making its last stand. He told them to remember what happened here. He told them that humanity does not surrender and does not yield. And then he said the words that would become legend. They were humanity, and they would not go quietly into the night. The fusion core breached. For a single instant, the Victory became a star. The explosion was so bright it could be seen from Earth without a telescope. The shockwave expanded at relativistic speeds and caught 300 crystal ships before they could react. The ships shattered like glass hit with hammers. Fragments scattered across the system. Their crystalline forms broken beyond repair. The remaining enemy ships paused in their advance as if stunned. The planet below went dark for several seconds as its formations processed what had happened. On Earth, Richard watched the explosion through long-range sensors. He bowed his head and said a prayer for the Victory and her crew. Around him, the command center fell silent. Everyone knew what that light meant. Heroes had died to buy them a few more weeks. Samantha sat at her console with tears running down her face. She had never met the Victory's crew, but she owed them everything. Their sacrifice gave her time to build more weapons, to strengthen Earth's defenses. The Crystal Fleet entered the solar system on a cold morning in March. Richard watched them appear on the long-range sensors, thousands of glowing dots moving in perfect formation toward Earth. The Victory's sacrifice had destroyed hundreds of ships, but over 2,000 remained, more than enough to overwhelm humanity's defenses. He opened communication channels to every military installation on Earth and in orbit. This was it. The moment they had prepared for. Time to see if humanity could survive. Samantha stood in the command center next to Richard and felt her heart pound. Her harmonic disruptors were mounted on ships and platforms throughout the system. She had worked every day for 6 months to build as many as possible. Production facilities ran 24 hours without stopping. In the end, they managed to create 400 disruptors. It was more than she hoped for, but still not enough. The weapons would have to be perfect. Every shot would have to count. Ryan checked his equipment on Platform 7 for the 10th time. The harmonic disruptor mounted on their station hummed with power. His crew stood ready at their posts. They were scared, but they did not show it. They had trained for this moment, run simulations and drills until they could operate in their sleep. But simulations were not real. The enemy ships on their screens were real. The danger was real. If they failed, Earth would fall. Ryan told his crew to stay focused and trust their training. They would do their duty and make the Victory proud. The Guardian Array opened fire first. 200 defense platforms unleashed their weapons simultaneously. Beams of shifting energy crossed the darkness and struck the leading enemy ships. The crystals glowed bright as they tried to adapt. Some ships managed to adjust to the first frequency shift, but then the second shift hit and cracks appeared on their surfaces. The third shift and entire sections shattered. The fourth shift and the ships exploded into fragments that tumbled through space. For a moment, Richard thought they might actually win. The harmonic disruptors worked better than anyone hoped. Enemy ships died by the dozens. But then the Crystal Fleet adapted. The ships in the rear watched what happened to the ships in front. They changed their formation and adjusted their crystalline structure. The next wave of disruptor fire did less damage, and the wave after that even less. The crystals learned so fast. Every tactic that worked once stopped working the second time. The enemy reached firing range and returned fire. Beams of pure crystalline energy lanced out and struck human ships. Where the beams hit, transformation began. Metal turned to crystal. Systems failed. Crews found themselves trapped as their ships changed around them. Platform 12 was hit directly and began to crystallize. The crew evacuated, but 3 people were too slow. They were sealed inside as the escape pods launched. Ryan watched it happen on his screen and felt sick. That could be them. That would be them eventually. Karen watched the battle from Mars through delayed transmissions. Light took time to cross space, so she saw everything minutes after it happened. The Martian defense fleet consisted of 12 warships. Nothing compared to Earth's armada. But they launched anyway. Karen gave the order herself. Every ship that could fight needed to be in the battle. If Earth fell, Mars would fall anyway. They might as well die fighting. The ships accelerated toward the enemy formation, their harmonic disruptors charging. Samantha saw the pattern emerging. The crystals adapted to every weapon frequency after seeing it twice. So the solution was to never use the same pattern twice. She started transmitting new frequency sequences to every disruptor in the fleet, random patterns that could not be predicted. It helped. The enemy ships started dying again, but it was not enough. For every crystal ship destroyed, 2 more advanced. The numbers were against humanity. The crystal ships reached Earth's atmosphere. Pods detached and fell like burning stars. They struck major cities around the globe. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, São Paulo, Cairo. The crystals began growing immediately, spreading through streets and buildings. Richard activated the ground defense protocols. Military units with portable harmonic disruptors deployed to every impact site. Civilian volunteers joined them. Anyone who could hold a weapon became a soldier. The battle was not just in space anymore. It was in the streets and homes where people lived. In New York, the crystals grew from the crater in Central Park. They spread like roots, covering grass and trees and walkways. Police and military formed a perimeter and opened fire with everything they had. The portable disruptors worked, but they were slower than the orbital weapons. Smaller and less powerful. For every meter of crystal they destroyed, 2 more meters grew. People evacuated the surrounding areas, but some refused to leave. This was their city. Their home. They would defend it even if it cost their lives. Platform 7 took a direct hit. Ryan felt the station shake and alarms screamed through the corridors. Hull breach on Deck 3. Casualties reported. The crystal beam had punched through their armor like paper. Ryan checked the damage and made a decision. They could still fire their disruptor. The weapon systems were intact, so they would keep fighting until the station came apart. He ordered everyone to evacuate except essential personnel. His weapons officer, his engineer, and himself. That was all they needed to keep shooting. Samantha made her final breakthrough while watching the battle. The disruptors worked by constantly shifting frequencies. But what if they could link all the disruptors together, create one massive weapon that used every power source on Earth? The energy required would be enormous. They would have to shut down everything. Every city, every factory, every system. Leave Earth completely dark for 30 seconds. But the pulse might be strong enough to hit every enemy ship in the solar system at once. It was desperate and dangerous. But they were losing. Desperate was all they had left. She explained the plan to Richard. He understood immediately. It could work. It could save Earth. Or it could fail and leave them defenseless. But doing nothing guaranteed defeat. Richard made the call to the Coalition Congress. The vote took less than 5 minutes. They approved the plan unanimously. Samantha sent the instructions to every power plant and every reactor on Earth. They would need perfect timing. Everything had to fire at exactly the same instant or the pulse would not form correctly. Karen received the same instructions on Mars. The Martian colonies would add their power to the pulse. It meant Ryan and every other person in space would be caught in the blast. The harmonic pulse would destroy the platforms they stood on. Richard called every station and every ship. He told them what was coming. He gave them a choice. They could evacuate or they could stay and aim their disruptors to strengthen the pulse. It would mean certain death. Ryan did not hesitate. He told Richard that Platform 7 would stay. So did Platform 3 and Platform 9 and dozens of others. They would give Earth every advantage possible. The crystal ships pushed closer. They surrounded the planet now. Landing pods rained down like meteors. The infection spread through every continent. Ground forces fought building by building, street by street. Millions of people died, but millions more kept fighting. Humanity would not break. They would not surrender. If this was the end, they would face it on their feet with weapons in their hands. Samantha counted down to the pulse activation. Every screen in the command center showed the same timer. 30 seconds. Around the world, cities went dark. Power grids shut down. Everything humans built to hold back the night went silent. The Earth disappeared into darkness. 20 seconds. Ryan aimed Platform 7's disruptor at the largest enemy ship. He hoped the pulse would work. Hoped his death would matter. 10 seconds. Karen watched from Mars as the red planet's generators reached maximum output. This was it. The moment that would decide if humanity lived or died. 5 seconds. Richard stood at attention. He thought about the Victory and her crew. About Lisa and Derek and all the others who sacrificed everything. 4 seconds. Samantha's hand hovered over the activation button. 3 seconds. Ryan smiled and whispered goodbye to his family back on Earth. 2 seconds. Karen closed her eyes and prayed to whatever gods might be listening. 1 second. The timer reached 0. Samantha pressed the button. Light filled the solar system. The harmonic pulse erupted from Earth and Mars simultaneously. A wave of cascading energy that washed across the solar system like a tsunami of light. Every frequency the disruptors could generate fired at once. Billions of shifts happening in a single second. The wave hit the crystal ships and they began to scream. Not sound exactly because sound does not travel in space, but sensors picked up vibrations as the crystalline structures resonated with the pulse. The ships glowed brighter and brighter until they could not hold the energy anymore. Then they shattered. Thousands of crystal ships exploded at the same moment, fragments spinning away in every direction. The enemy fleet that had seemed unstoppable broke apart like glass hit by a sledgehammer. The ships closer to Earth took the worst of it. They were already damaged from earlier fighting and the pulse finished them. Ships farther out survived longer, but even they could not adapt fast enough. The frequency shifts came too fast and too chaotic. Within 30 seconds, every crystal ship in the solar system was destroyed. On Earth, the pulse swept across the surface and hit the growing crystal formations. The infection that had spread through cities and forests began to vibrate. Cracks appeared. The crystals lost their glow and turned gray. People fighting in the streets watched in amazement as the formations crumbled to dust around them. Buildings covered in crystal suddenly were clean again. The infection dissolved like it had never existed. Soldiers who had been transformed stood frozen for a moment, then collapsed as the crystal structure holding them broke. Some of them were dead. Their bodies could not survive the transformation, but others gasped and breathed and opened their eyes. They were human again. Platform 7 disintegrated in the pulse just as Ryan knew it would. The energy tore through the station and ripped it apart. Ryan felt weightless as the deck disappeared beneath his feet. He was thrown into space with no suit and no air. It should have killed him instantly. But the pulse had only lasted 30 seconds. As it faded, emergency systems kicked in. Rescue ships launched from Earth and began searching for survivors. They found Ryan floating unconscious but alive. His engineer was gone. His weapons officer made it. Out of 50 crew members on Platform 7, 12 survived. Richard stood in the command center and watched the sensor displays. All contacts showing as destroyed or disabled. No enemy ships remained. The solar system was clear. Around him, people started cheering. They hugged each other and cried with relief. Richard allowed himself a small smile. They had won. Against impossible odds, humanity survived. But the victory came at a terrible cost. He pulled up the casualty reports and felt the smile fade. Over 2 billion people dead. Entire cities destroyed. 53 orbital platforms lost with all hands. The Martian defense fleet reduced to 3 ships. Samantha sat at her console and shook. The pulse had worked. Her theory had been correct. But seeing the death toll made her feel sick. She had designed the weapon that saved Earth but also killed billions of people who were already transformed. There had been no way to target just the enemy ships. The pulse hit everything. All those people trapped in crystal forms had been shattered along with the enemy fleet. She told herself it was necessary, that they would have died anyway. But the guilt would stay with her forever. Karen walked through the Martian settlements and helped dig survivors from collapsed tunnels. The pulse had been devastating to the underground colonies. Power failures caused cave-ins and life support failures. Mars lost 800,000 people, more than a quarter of its population. But they were alive. The colony survived. As Karen pulled a young girl from the rubble, she thought about how close they came to extinction. How easily it could have gone the other way. She held the girl tight and promised her things would get better. The rescue operations continued for weeks. Ships searched the debris fields for survivors from destroyed platforms. They found people in emergency pods floating in space waiting for help. They found others who were not so lucky. The dead were given proper funerals. The living were brought home to recover. Ryan spent 3 days in a medical center being treated for exposure and radiation. When he finally walked out, the first thing he saw was Earth hanging in space above him. The planet looked different. Scarred by the battle, but still beautiful. Still home. Richard began the process of rebuilding. The Coalition Congress met and created new policies. Every nation agreed to maintain a permanent defense fleet. They would build more ships and more weapons. Establish early warning systems throughout the solar system. Earth would never be caught unprepared again. Production facilities that made harmonic disruptors would keep making them. The weapons would be mounted on satellites and stations, ready to fire at the first sign of crystal infection. Samantha was offered a position as head of Earth's Defense Research Department. She accepted reluctantly. Part of her wanted to leave science behind after what she had seen. But someone needed to study the crystal fragments and make sure they never threatened humanity again. She established labs on the moon where samples could be contained safely. Her team spent months analyzing the fragments, learning everything they could. They discovered the crystals were incredibly old, billions of years. They had consumed countless civilizations across the galaxy. Earth was just one of many worlds that faced the threat, and Earth was the first to survive. A memorial was built in Geneva, in the plaza outside the Coalition Congress building. It was a simple design, a black stone wall with names carved into it. Every person who died in the war had their name on that wall. It took months to carve them all, over 2 billion names. At the center of the memorial stood a statue showing Captain Derek Hayes at the helm of the Victory, his crew around him. The statue was made from metal salvaged from the ship's wreckage that had drifted back to Earth. At the base, an inscription read what Derek said in his final transmission: that humanity does not yield. Ryan visited the memorial on the anniversary of the battle. He walked along the wall and found the names of his crew members from Platform 7. He traced their names with his fingers and said a silent prayer. Around him, thousands of other people did the same. Families looking for lost loved ones, soldiers paying respect to fallen comrades, children learning about the war from their parents. The memorial became a place where people came to remember and to understand what they almost lost. Karen brought a delegation from Mars to see the memorial. The Martian colonies wanted their own version built on the Red Planet. They wanted future generations to know the price of survival. As Karen looked at all those names, she thought about how the war changed everything. Before the crystals came, humans fought each other over resources and territory. After the war, those conflicts seemed petty and meaningless. Humanity realized they were alone in a dangerous universe. They needed to stand together or they would fall separately. New ships patrolled the borders of human space, watching for any sign of the crystals. Captains trained specifically to recognize the threat. Every vessel carried harmonic disruptors and instructions on how to use them. Earth established colonies on dozens of worlds, spreading humanity across the galaxy. If one world fell, others would survive. They would never put all their hope in a single planet again. Scientists studied the crystal planet in the Kepler system from a safe distance. The formations there went dark after the harmonic pulse, but something still lived inside them. Dormant but not dead, waiting for another victim to stumble into their trap. Richard ordered the system quarantined. No ships were allowed within 10 light years. Automated stations monitored the planet constantly. If the crystals ever became active again, humanity would know. Ryan accepted a promotion and became the captain of a new ship called the Victory II. The Coalition Congress decided to honor the original Victory by keeping the name alive. Ryan felt the weight of that responsibility. He was not Derek Hayes. He could never be that brave or that selfless. But he could try. He could serve with honor and protect humanity the way the first Victory did. On the day he took command, Ryan stood on the bridge and looked at his crew. He told them they served on a ship with a legacy. The Victory saved humanity once. The Victory II would make sure humanity never needed saving again. Samantha continued her research but also started teaching. She gave lectures at universities about the war and what humanity learned. She talked about the importance of preparation and vigilance, about how curiosity and exploration had to be balanced with caution, about how humanity's greatest strength was their ability to adapt and overcome. Students listened carefully. They had grown up hearing stories about the Crystal War. Now they heard the truth from someone who lived it. Karen became the governor of Mars and led the colony's recovery. Within 5 years, the population was back to pre-war levels. Within 10 years, Mars had grown beyond what it was before. The colony built its own shipyards and defense platforms. Mars would defend itself and never again rely completely on Earth. Karen looked at what her people built and felt pride. They had faced extinction and survived. They had lost so much but refused to give up. That was the human spirit. That was what made humanity special. Richard retired after 20 years as head of Earth's defense forces. He spent his final years writing a detailed history of the